Okay, so good evening everybody, and welcome. Welcome. It's great to see so many people here for the first inaugural Beacon lecture. I'm Robert Shaughnessy. I'm the acting director of the Beacon Institute, which is one of the university's 50th anniversary Beacon projects. And the Beacon Institute, which is based in the School of Arts, is about sort of creating bridges and conversations between arts and sciences. And we've had a lot of frantic and exciting activity over the course of the last year, and we're now sort of moving into our second year, and what better way of sort of inaugurating that than with this lecture by Murray. I don't need really to spend too much time introducing Murray, because otherwise you wouldn't be here, because I think you know all about what Murray has done. But just to sort of mention just a couple of things, that Murray came to the University of Kent in 1992, was made Professor of Film in 2000, and has obviously held that post ever since. That Murray has a wide range of interests sort of across the film, but in particular, and that's the focus of what he's going to be talking about this evening, about the kind of intersections between film and cognitive science and philosophy, in particular philosophy of mind. So Murray, there's a range of books that Murray's published on this. The first book was Engaging Characters back in 1995, is that right? Yeah, 1995. And then most recently there's an edited collection, Thinking Through Film, in 2006. And then forthcoming next year is the monograph which Murray has shamelessly sort of borrowed the title from, Film, Art and the Third Culture, which is really sort of looking at the ways, if you remember that famous formulation by C.P. Snow about the two cultures, about arts and science, and how there might be a sort of way of triangulating a third way that Murray is going to be addressing. So just the other thing to say, Murray does have his lighter side. Amongst his outputs, there is a book on train spotting, the Danny Boyle movie, and Murray also did the video commentary for Lars van Trier's Antichrist. So I think you must agree that he's quite a barrel of light. He's got a sense of humour, clearly. So the way Murray will be talking for how long? 45 minutes or an hour?
I'll easily.
Yeah. So Murray will talk, and then he will welcome any kind of questions that we might have afterwards, questions and comments afterwards, and then we will then adjourn. There is a reward. There are drinks on the mezzanine afterwards. So hopefully many of you as can will be able to join us for that. So enough of me. So will you join me in welcoming Murray Smith?
Thanks, Robert, for that very generous introduction. And can I thank you and Nikki, Sarah, the entire Beacon team for the invitation to deliver this lecture. Very pleased to be here to do that. And while I'm doing thanks, did the Simon Langton posse make it? We were expecting a group from the Simon Langton School, but they're not here yet. Maybe they'll make a dramatic entrance as we go along if they can make it through the gale, which we can hear. And there are a number of people who've travelled from beyond the confines of the university, so particular thanks and welcome to those people. Thanks to my family for putting up with me. I usually kind of forget to say that in these kinds of occasions, so I had a note to say it today. And a couple of other preliminary remarks. First of all, in addition to the fact that this is an inaugural lecture for the Beacon Centre. In addition, it's doubling up as programmed within the Being Human Festival, which is a national festival of humanities events. And the background to that festival is really to kind of advocate for the value of the humanities within the university system, in the context of doubts about the value of the humanities relative to the sciences. So I hope by the end of this lecture you'll understand that whatever I say about the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, I am an advocate for that position, right? I think the humanities are really important, and this is just one way, I think, of making that claim. And I'm afraid that being part of that festival comes with some strings attached. So you might get an email asking you to fill in an evaluation form or something like that. Right? It's the age of impact. Yes, we know it. So that would be great if you can respond to that. And the last preliminary thing I wanted to say, without being too portentous about this, I was thinking, given that it's this kind of occasion, should I say something about the events of this past weekend? And we've had plenty of that over the last few days. So I don't quite want to say the standard things, but what I did want to say is that amongst the freedoms that we enjoy in our society is academic freedom. And that's a really important freedom and value that we have in our culture. So I'm going to exercise it right now, and I invite you to exercise it in return when I've finished talking in 45 minutes or so. So, yeah, I think that's all the preliminaries out of the way. So let me just quickly begin by giving you a kind of map of what I'm going to try and do tonight. So the very first thing I'll do in just a second is talk about the title itself, right? Because not everyone will recognize or at least have a very full grasp of what that expression, the third culture, means. I mean, Robert is absolutely right that it is connected with the debate from the 1960s, and I'll say more about that in just a second. But just to show you what's coming after that, once I've talked a little bit about the third culture and the two cultures debate, then I'm going to talk about a particular kind of model, right, that I've developed for talking about how we should go about understanding our responses to film in particular and art in general, right? So that's what I call triangulation. Okay, so I'll be talking about that model a little bit. Then the kind of guts of the lecture, right, and the point at which if there's any fun to be had, this is where the fun will be had, is in relation to those three case studies. Okay, so essentially they're going to be case studies trying to exemplify the general model, which I'm going to talk about before the case studies. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks. So, the title, first of all, not by design, but just by the vagaries of publicity. I noticed that those two commas in the title tended to kind of disappear and get moved around, right? So that's where the commas should be in the title. And the one way in which removing one of those commas makes a difference, like sometimes the title was publicized as Film Art and the Third Culture with no commas. Now you might interpret that, right, that form of the title as being about film art, meaning there's some special case we need to make to defend the idea that films can constitute works of art, which was a big deal in the first half of the 20th century, right? But it's not a big deal anymore, right? So that's not what I'm interested in discussing tonight. I don't think anyone has really taken that to be a live debate, with the exception of Roger Scruton, who still thinks that film is not an art form. But other than Roger Scruton, you know, it's mostly a historical argument, a very interesting one, but mostly a historical one, and one that I'm not engaging with tonight. So the point of the title is I'm really interested in the relationship between art and the sciences, with film as our primary case study, our primary art form. But you can generalize to a large degree beyond what I have to say about film to other art forms. Okay. So, right, so what is the third culture, first of all? So, as Robert correctly said, that phrase, the third culture, goes back to the well-known debate, which actually kicked off in 1956. That was the first essay published by C.P. Snow. Snow was a physicist by training, but also became a novelist. Okay, so he was somebody who straddled the world of the sciences and the arts. He was also a politician, so a kind of Renaissance man, if you like. So he was the person who triggered this debate, beginning in 1956, making the argument that he saw in Western intellectual culture, let's say, a damaging schism between the culture of the sciences, and by which he had in mind principally the natural sciences, and the culture of, well, he used the phrase literary intellectuals was the expression he used, but what he meant was broadly the humanities, the arts and the humanities. Okay, so he wasn't in favor of two cultures, right, but this is what he detected or claimed was there and was worsening. And Leavis, the kind of famous, the most famous literary critic of the period, reacted very angrily and dismissively to Snow's argument, essentially saying, well, it's right that there are two cultures. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but he certainly rejected the premises and the arguments of Snow. So the third culture expression was one first used by Snow to express an ideal of a more integrated culture between the arts and the sciences. Okay, so that's where we're going with my use of the term, right? To what extent is it possible and desirable to have some kind of positive integration between the knowledge and the methods ranging from the humanities across to the natural sciences? And just to quickly mention some other kind of historical background here, you know, there's a tendency to think about this as, you know, a debate that kind of happened in the 1960s and we've moved beyond it, or at least in some places you'll find that view expressed. I think it's completely wrong, right? I think the debate goes much further back in history and it's still very much with us. So these are just some examples, right, of how it crops up. And for the sake of speed, I'm just going to sort of jump back to my earliest example and then forward to my most recent. So here we've got Spinoza in 1677, right? I won't read the whole quote, don't worry, but here's Spinoza starting off saying, most writers on the emotions and on human conduct seem to be treating rather of matters outside nature than of natural phenomena, for not following nature's general laws. They appear to conceive man to be situated in nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. Okay, now that phrase, a kingdom within a kingdom, you know, is one that's sort of resonated throughout history as a way of giving expression to the idea that the study of human culture, human behavior, needs to be kind of conducted on the basis of a different set of principles to those which apply to the non-human physical world. Okay, so if you like, now that's not Spinoza's position, right? He's arguing against that, but that expression has been used by others to advocate for the alternative position. So what Spinoza does in that quote is he carries on to say, this is a mistake, right? Human beings are a part of the natural order, right? And we have to find some way of examining human behavior which makes sense of that fact, right? That humans don't stand outside the natural order. Okay, so that's my historical example. And here's my recent one, 2 days ago, okay? So I comfort myself with the thought that there are at least 3 people in the world who are interested in this debate, right? Me, Raymond Tallis, and James Ladyman. So this was a debate 2 days ago at, I think, the Royal Society. I've forgotten, but I got my email about it. And again, I won't read the whole thing, but there's the motion to be debated by the two of them. Human nature is better understood through science than through philosophical and artistic reflection. Okay, where I would guess James Ladyman, who is a philosopher of science, would be arguing in favor of the motion broadly, and Raymond Tallis would be opposed to it. And the opening line there is important, I think, too. Evolutionary biology, psychology, and brain science have all made astonishing progress over recent decades. Again, I'm not going to read the rest, but those are indeed, as it were, the sciences which are the kind of the flashpoints in terms of recent arguments around the two sciences. This is where it gets controversial and contested. Okay. So what do I mean then by the third culture, right? So far I've just given you some kind of general background of what the two cultures debate was in the 1960s and how it's part of a much more long-standing argument in philosophy especially about the principles by which we investigate different aspects and parts of the world. Okay, so what's the positive vision? So I'll be putting some flesh on this compressed expression of the idea as I go along, but to try and summarize it, my idea is the third culture is integrating the knowledge integrating the knowledge and methods of artistic practice, the humanities, and the sciences in the cause of explanation. So in other words, we're drawing on everything from art-making practice itself through humanities disciplines which analyze art as their subject matter right across the various sciences. And we look for ways in which those different methods and different sources of knowledge can be meaningfully integrated. That's the general principle. Let me contrast it quickly with a different way in which the third culture idea has been taken up by at least one other person. So there's a book edited by John Brockman from 1995, which is just called The Third Culture. And John Brockman is a kind of, I guess you'd call him an intellectual entrepreneur, right? He runs this website called edge.com, and his shtick is basically to get usually public intellectual scientists, but they're almost always scientists, to speak out on questions coming from the humanities, right? So do you see what I'm saying? It's one-way traffic, right? That's the way Brockman uses the idea of the third culture. That it's like, move over, you humanists, the scientists are coming, right? So now that was interesting. I'm arguing against that, right? Right. So somebody somewhere in this evening is going to use the word scientism. That Smith, he's so, you know, he's so bound up, he's so enamored with the sciences, right? So scientism is the idea that you think the natural sciences can answer every question under the sun. I'm not making that argument. That's the John Brockman position. Rather, what I'm saying is we need to look for ways in which we can integrate the things that most of the people in this room focus on doing, right? Humanistic methods, with the methods we can learn from the sciences. So it's a very different emphasis. And you might notice in that first bullet point, right, I'm saying that I'm looking to integrate these things in the cause of explanation, or maybe I should say in the name of explanation, right? And what I'm saying there is these are the kinds of questions, right? These are the ones that I'm going to be looking at tonight. And these are the kinds of questions which I think are apt to be answered by drawing upon this range of methods, right? So I'll just do the middle one, okay, you can read the rest. What are the levers of emotional response to film characters, right? So in other words, what are the aspects of our psychology, right, which filmmakers, whether intuitively or with more explicit knowledge, exploit, draw upon in order to get us to respond emotionally to characters, to like them, to dislike them, to empathize with them, and so forth. So these questions, what I'm calling questions which are explanatory in the focus, you know, are not the same as questions which have an evaluative focus, like, was Hitchcock a great filmmaker, right? Or interpretive questions. What meanings can we ascribe to Strangers on a Train, which is one of the films I'll be showing you a clip from. So I'm emphasizing this to say that what I'm going to say tonight might have implications for those other questions, right? Evaluative questions, appreciative questions, interpretive questions, but they're not the focus of the argument, right? And it's, I think, really important to, as it will, keep clear about the kind of question you're asking, because that points you in the direction of different kinds of appropriate method. Okay. Let me also note this, what I'm going to call here the other side of the third cultural coin, right? So if we're talking about the third culture being some kind of project whereby we try to get beyond the two cultures, right? We're trying to get these two, you know, communities to meaningfully interact with one another, right? Then you might say, well, hang on, what about what the sciences might have to learn from, you know, the humanities in terms of the character of the sciences, So I'm stressing so far what we can learn, how we can answer questions in the humanities, right, more effectively or more deeply or more adequately by drawing upon some scientific methods. But you can ask the other question, right? You know, maybe it will do scientists, you know, some good to reflect on their practices, you know, using the practices and methods of cultural historians, for example. And I'm not going to deny that at all, right? That's well established, right, as an area of practice, right? I will say this. I think it's very difficult to do those things simultaneously, right? It's sort of like, you know, you need one leg to stand on, right? So I'm not going to be doing that tonight, but I'm stressing that I think this is a valuable thing, an important thing. Science has a history. It didn't fall from the sky complete, right? So that's a fact that needs to be analysed and understood. But as I say, this is, you know, this is an ongoing project, right? And I think one that it doesn't need my help, right? I just acknowledge it along the way. I will say this. Many of you in this room will know that one of the 4 kind of master themes of the Arts and Humanities Research Council is called Science in Culture, right? And I think this is really what they're mostly interested in, not the thing that I'm emphasizing. I might be wrong on that. Maybe there's some debate to be had about this. But I think the very phrasing, science in culture, you know, is a hint that that's what they're mostly thinking about, right? So, enough on that. Now, so far I've been talking in a fairly broad brush way about science, right, with an emphasis on natural science. Let me make one distinction here between scientific knowledge and scientific method. And I'm doing this because I'm saying they're kind of like different, so to speak, strengths, right, of the project which I'm advocating here, different degrees of strength with which you could undertake it. So a minimal constraint, right, the weakest version, right, of what I'm arguing in favour of would be to say, okay, well, in exploring artistic phenomena like film, right, we shouldn't invoke outmoded, you know, explanatory frameworks, right? So if anyone submits a paper to me, right, based on alchemy or geocentrism, right, not surprisingly, I'm going to say, there's maybe something wrong here, right? Now, what I held off from doing was putting some other candidates in those brackets, right? Because I didn't want tonight to descend into a war, right? A kind of more localized war. My point simply is this. Everyone, I think, right, will sign up to that, except perhaps for the most radical relativist, right, who just doesn't think there is such a thing as knowledge, full stop. Everyone will sign up to that principle because they'll put something in that box, which they'll say is just beyond the bounds of respectability, right? So that's why I've restricted myself to mostly a set of once respectable theories of parts of the world which are now not taken. They're regarded as superseded and outmoded. Persistence of vision, I should say, until very recently was regarded as a psychologically respectable theory of how it is that films induce an impression of motion in us. But it isn't anymore, right? So that's not very old. And some film theorists will still casually refer to persistence of vision as if it still has currency. All right, so that's the weakest one, the weakest version. Then it gets a bit stronger, right? Okay, what we should do is actively look to our best current emerging understanding of the world in order to enhance our understanding of the arts. Okay? Now, my best example of that I'm going to give you tonight bears on mirror neurons. Right? Everyone's heard of mirror neurons. Okay, I'm sure. I will try and put a little detail on what you may already know about that and show you how maybe that emerging body of knowledge about an aspect of the brain can shed some new, interesting light on the way films work. So that's what I have in mind there. And that's, you know, that's where I am, right? I'm in the middle, right? So, you know, it's a case of trying to keep your eyes wide open and be attentive to developments, you know, across the sciences for things which might have sometimes an unexpected bearing on the way the arts work. An even more robust third cultural approach would be the one at the bottom, which is where you don't just look for, as it were, emerging or established scientific knowledge. You actually get your hands dirty, right? You start to adopt scientific methods. So maybe the best example of this, not from the area of the arts, but there's a sort of movement within philosophy which goes by the name XPhi, which stands for experimental philosophy. So these are philosophers who have gotten out of their armchairs and now do experimental studies. Some of them are neuroscientific, some of them are more survey-based, right? But that's an example of what I mean by the third, stronger variant on the third cultural idea. And of course, that's not to say they're abandoning traditional philosophical methods. They're supplementing it, right, by drawing in those scientific methods. Okay, let's move on to some case studies. Right, so in theory, the first of these three case studies is going to be fairly brisk, and I just want to kind of use it to quickly give you a flavor of the idea, and then the second two case studies will be a little more fully elaborated. So we're going to begin this with a commercial break. Okay, so forgive me for sullying the not-for-profit atmosphere with an advert, but I'm not using it for those purposes. So just pay attention.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so. So there we have it. Proof that the new Skoda Fabia is truly attention-stealing.
Right, now I offer that up to you, not as proof of anything about the Skoda Fabia, but as a demonstration of a theory of visual perception which is known as change blindness. So change blindness is a theory of perception which puts an emphasis on how extremely selective human vision is, right? That we only really attend to a very small part of the visual field which is available to us at any given moment, right? So what that little exercise demonstrates is that if you're told to watch this part of the visual field, and in that example, of course, it was the car, right? Look how wonderful this new car is, right? Look at the headlights, right? Then every time there's one of those flashes, right? You notice that there were those periodic flashes in the course of the little film, right? Your attention goes back to that car, right? And you don't notice, so you'll all have noticed some changes, right? But I doubt that anyone will have gotten more than a small fraction of the numerous changes which happen over the course of that short film. So that's what change blindness is, and it became famous mostly through this experiment, the invisible gorilla experiment, right? Where what the experimenters did was they had subjects watch this little video of a group of people playing basketball, and while they're playing basketball, a man or a person in a gorilla suit walks right through the middle of them, and then, they were instructed to follow the basketball. Right? So they're watching this and they're told, keep track of where the basketball is, right? And an amazingly small percentage of these viewing subjects registered the gorilla at all. But if you take a still like the one we have here, I mean, it's just plain as day. The gorilla is right there, right? Just as an aside, the same group of psychologists also talk about a phenomenon they call change blindness, which is unwillingness to admit that, right, that, you know, your perception can be so faulty or so selective and gappy. All right, so what's the relevance of all this? Okay, this is a body of scientific experiment and theory about the nature of visual perception. And it's been deployed in relation to understanding how continuity editing works in film. So continuity editing is just the very widespread mainstream practice of film editing, which enables filmmakers to put together scenes through a multitude of different shots, but where essentially your attention is not drawn normally to any of those cuts, right? So imagine a filmmaker who makes a film of this. Indeed, we have one at the back there, right? A film of this occasion, right? And it cuts between shots of me talking and you guys listening at this point in the course set, right? We would all underestimate, or at least those of us who are, as it were, watching it in an untrained normal mode, we would all underestimate the number of cuts that occur in that. And that's because, according to this theory, right, if you put together shots in a certain way, you can make the viewer blind to those cuts, just as the theory of change blindness suggests. Now, that's quite a recent psychological theory, right, developed in the 1990s. Okay, how does this fit together then with what we already knew? Okay, so this is probably the neatest sketch I can offer you tonight, because the next two examples are going to get much messier, right? So, but this I think is a pretty neat example of the idea that by combining the resources of artist practitioners, humanities theorists, and scientists, we get something larger than each of those taken individually. So the way it worked was, first of all, filmmakers figured out how to get continuity, right, in practice. So over the first 20 or 30 years of film history, filmmakers were the ones who worked out, yeah, if we compose a shot this way and we edit it this way, we get this fluidity, and people don't spot the cut, right? So they developed a kind of know-how, a kind of tacit knowledge, right, of how this could work. They didn't have a theory of change blindness, right? But they worked out a tacit, practical theory of how to do this. Then you get film theorists articulating those ideas in more explicit principles. So a particularly kind of telling moment was in the 1920s in the Soviet Union, when filmmakers like Eisenstein and Kuleshov, who were filmmakers, but they were also very self-conscious, reflective filmmakers, started to articulate these principles in theoretical form. Okay? So that's, so to speak, stage two. We've got the kind of practical figuring out of how you achieve continuity. Then you've got a kind of articulation of it in theoretical terms by people like Eisenstein. And then what the psychology does, right, is it enables you to understand what it is about the nature of human perception which allows those practices to work. So the idea is when you put all of those three layers of knowledge together, you've got something bigger and deeper and more powerful, right, than you had before, right? So I said that the questions I'm addressing tonight have an explanatory focus, right? And one of my assumptions is that explanations come in degrees. You can have a better or a worse, a shallow or a deep explanation of something, right? So the spirit of what I'm really saying is, if we open our doors to ideas like change blindness, we will get richer, deeper explanations, or we may do, in relation to certain questions. Okay, let me forge on, since time is really zooming by. So I'm going to keep this very light, right? I'm not going to kind of give you the kind of heavy-duty version of this idea. So triangulation is the kind of model that I develop in this book manuscript for how we might approach understanding broadly any mental phenomenon. But what we're interested in here, well, I'm interested in at least, is our experience and responses to movies, okay, which is a type of mental phenomenon. And the idea of triangulation, put in very simple terms, is simply that we need to draw on all three of these types of evidence, right? So phenomenological evidence is simply, you know, your experience of something. How does it feel, right, when you're undergoing this type of thing, right? That can often be enhanced by introspection, by reflecting explicitly on the nature of an experience. But in addition to that, we also have various psychological ideas about the functions and the capacities of the mind. So memory, for example, right? We have whether they're everyday ideas or more theoretical ones, we have assumptions about what capacities our minds possess. And thirdly, increasingly, right, we have a fairly detailed picture of how these psychological capacities and the experiences we have, how they're realized through the operations of the brain. Okay? So neuroscience is giving us an ever more detailed picture of that type of evidence. So triangulation is essentially simply the idea, right, that we need to look to how these three types of evidence hook up and link with each other, right? Maybe that sounds like an unexceptional idea, but just trust me, different traditions of philosophy and psychology, so to speak, aggressively defend one of those three, if you see what I'm saying, rather than taking what you might call the kind of ecumenical approach that I'm arguing for here. So that's just a quick picture of the general model. So let me come on to my second case study. So I'm going to talk a bit about empathy. Empathy is really the focus of this case study, but I just need to do a little bit of scene setting to distinguish empathy from some other similar things. So the words empathy and sympathy are often, sometimes used interchangeably, certainly used quite loosely sometimes. So the basic distinction we're after between those two terms is between feeling for and feeling with, right? So sympathy is feeling for someone. Empathy picks out the idea that, well, we're not just kind of with them in some sense, but we're actually mirroring to some degree or in some way the experience they're having. That's at least a standard way of using the term empathy and the way I'll use it tonight. It's only one part of the larger landscape of kind of emotional responses we have to film. Okay, so nobody should run away with the impression that I'm saying, when you watch a movie, it's all about empathy. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a subroutine, and that's just a fancy way of saying empathizing with characters is one route we have to understanding and experiencing a film in its totality. Right? If I get to my third case study, which I'm increasingly doubting I will, but if I get to it, part of the idea of that third case study, which is about suspense, is to stress that, you know, there are lots of aspects of movie watching which involve something other than mirroring the states of individual characters. Right? So I'll just say that now in case we don't get to it. Now, here's a little bit of science. Here's one study that was done, which plays a kind of, well, let me tell you what, I'll talk through the study and then explain how I think it helps us. So it's this one here. It's called the body swap illusion. So what these pair of scientists did was they conducted a study which explored the extent to which we can be made to have a kind of out-of-body experience, right? Tricked into the sense that our sense of physical location is somewhere other than it actually is, right? And the way this was achieved was through these kind of head cameras, right, which you can see are on the dummy on the right and the human subject on the left, okay? So what's going on here essentially is that the human subject on the left is being fed in his visor with the visual information coming from the dummy's camera on the right-hand side. And simultaneously, the lucky experimenter in the middle, right, is, well, it looks like the stomach, right, is kind of rubbing the stomach of the dummy and the the subject simultaneously, right? Now, if you combine the visual and the tactile cues, right, a strange thing happens, which is that the human subject feels like they're located in the physical position of the dummy, okay? Now, that's a pretty powerful version of the idea of empathy, right? You want to talk about empathy, right? Imagine watching a movie where you felt physically located, right, in the position of a character wandering around in the fictional world, right? Now, that's not what happens, I say, in ordinary movie viewing, right? But sometimes you find critics using language which suggests that it is, right? You know, I really felt like I was there with those characters in their world, right? So the role of this particular experiment is to specify, in this case, one rather extreme version of what we might understand by empathy, and to kind of rule it out, right? At least with respect to ordinary movie viewing, this is not going on. Of course, it's possible. We already have so-called 4D cinema. It's not impossible to imagine, right, a future form, right, which involved tactile stimulation as well as visual and audio stimulation, which did have these kinds of effects, right? But it's not going to explain how regular cinema as we know it works, right? So the role, again, to stress the idea here is this is a way of kind of clarifying one thing that empathy could be and saying, well, that doesn't explain what's going on in ordinary film viewing. So that's still a contribution to our understanding. Right, I'll skip that. This is just to kind of say how one would kind of exemplify that model of triangulation in relation to the question of empathy, right? The way we would kind of look for evidence at those three levels as it bears specifically on empathy. But I'm going to jump forward to talk about a body of theory which I'm going to suggest does, unlike the experiment we've just seen, makes a kind of direct and positive contribution, right, to what's happening in movie experience in relation to empathy. And this is this is what I alluded to earlier when I made reference to mirror neurons. So Vittorio Galeazzi, you see the name in the middle there, Galeazzi and Friedberg. Galeazzi was one of the discoverers of mirror neurons in Italy in the 1990s. And he's a neuroscientist, but he's collaborated both with art historians. So David Friedberg is an art historian. And more recently, I'll show you these now. This is a book coming out next year. He's collaborated with a young Italian film scholar, Michele Guerra, to extend these ideas about the function of mirror neurons in movie viewing, as well as painting and sculpture. So what does he have to say, or what do they collaboratively have to say? So the core of their theory is what they call embodied simulation. Embodied simulation. And to understand that, I need to say just a few words about the very idea of mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are neurons which respond both when we undertake an action and when we observe that action occurring. Okay? And they were discovered almost by accident by this team of Italian neuroscientists, right? They were conducting studies to observe something else, and they noticed that the monkeys' brains they were studying kept firing unexpectedly. And what they were, responding to was the sight of things being picked up and not merely activating when the monkeys themselves were using their limbs to pick things up. Okay? So that's why they're called mirror neurons, right? Because the idea is that the brain seems to be, in certain contexts, responding in the same fashion, right, as a person undertaking an action. Yeah? So the nub of the way this idea, this body of evidence regarding mirror neurons, which I should say, subsequently we discovered to be a part of human neural makeup, right? Not just macaque monkeys where they were first discovered. The way that they have extended this into, first of all, the analysis of painting and sculpture, and now film, is to say that when we visually appreciate certain actions, certain gestures, certain emotional expressions, we're not just, so to speak, coolly registering those things. The act of recognizing it as the action that it is involves some kind of low-level mimicry of actually doing that or undergoing that experience. So, to give you, right, so here are two images they use here. Right? I'll just speak to one of them for the sake of time. But they talk about the idea that when we, in the Caravaggio painting on the left, when we see that image, right, we don't just cognitively recognize that a certain action is being undertaken, but our minds, through the operations of our brain, are simulating that very action. So to understand the action is to kind of imaginatively simulate it to a degree. That's the nub of the theory. Now, let me give you a film example. Well, there's a quotation, right, from the essay where they make that claim. Vision of another person being touched automatically activates the cortical network of areas that are normally involved in the experience of being touched, as is clear from our experience of viewing paintings such as the Caravaggio image. So that's the core idea. Now, I've got a range of, that basic idea, if I had time, I'd suggest ramifies in all sorts of ways. In other words, we can look at, I'll just flick this slide back up a second. Right, this is my list of kind of like a multitude of examples, right, where you take that basic idea about mirror neurons and embodied simulation and you think about how that might be being exploited in different types of film, different individual films, right? And that's where the expertise, I should say, of the humanist comes in. Right? That's where Galeazzi needs to be working with David Friedberg and with Michele Guerra, right? Because he needs a rich diversity of types of filmmaking to really make this count. Right? That's where the collaboration and the integration bites. Okay, I'm just going to jump to one sequence, and to my film colleagues here, I apologize now, but this is in the wrong aspect ratio, right? But I didn't have time to fix it. Okay, so this is a sequence I'm going to show you from Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train. Okay, just remember that the first mirror neuron studies from the 1990s were concerned with monkeys grasping objects. Okay, keep that in mind as we watch this.
into a dogfight. There you go. Down there. My cigarette case. It's very valuable.
Down here?
Yes, you've got to get that grading up right away.
What's the trouble?
Well, can't we do something? I dropped my cigarette case.
Mightn't be any good, mister. Probably gone down a storm drain.
Storm drain?
On the other hand, maybe lodged on the edge.
Don't they have a trap down there, like under a sink, you know? Well, don't just stand here. Do something.
I guess we could phone the city engineer, all right. Worst he could do would be to tell you to go take a run.
Now, look, mister.
Relax, mister.
I don't want to relax.
Hey, Mr. Hayes.
Guy Haynes is mighty grim and determined, and he needs but one more game for the entire match. Just 1 point between Haynes and the match.
Advantage, Mr. Hayes. Advantage, Mr. Hayes.
Must make a run of that, whatever it is.
Okay, so you can probably see the kind of logic of that choice as an example, right? And this is quite characteristic of Hitchcock, right? He'll often milk a very simple action for all it's worth, right? So the simple action of trying to reach for and get hold of that damn lighter on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the cross-cut images, the tennis players, right? He's trying to, if the theory, right, the Galeazzi, Freeberg, Guerra theory about embodied simulation is roughly on the right tracks, the idea is that by a filmmaker really dwelling and focusing your attention in such an extended fashion, right, you really get to feel, right, the force of those actions, right? It's compelling a kind of embodied simulation. That's what they're saying. This is one version, maybe I should say in passing. When you hear the expression embodied cognition, this is one form of theory behind that idea of embodied cognition, right? That to think through seeing actions, emotional expressions involves a kind of embodied response and not just a purely mental, disembodied one. Now, if there were time, I would show to you the most erotic scene in all of cinema, but I'm going to deprive you of that experience for the sake of time, because it's another brilliant example of the simplest possible, way of staging a kiss, but just sustaining it, right? So it has that kind of force that I've just been talking about in relation to the action of grasping. But we need to press on. Now, the third case study bears upon suspense. and a particular variety of suspense, right? Anomalous, so-called anomalous suspense, right? So the idea here is that suspense, as it's sort of generally understood, involves sort of anxiety over an unknown outcome, or if not necessarily anxiety, but a sense of desire to find out what's going to happen in a sequence of events, right? So again, just jumping, I will show you this clip because it's kind of fun. Here's a kind of what I would consider, you know, a plum example of orthodox suspense, all right? So 45 seconds of Wayne Rooney. Can we stand it? Just
Got to then still weather a storm. You've got to still stay together. Rooney. Kept it towards Giggs, who's onside. And Wayne Rooney! The best moment yet in the mercurial career of Wayne Rooney. He has never scored a more important goal than that. He may never score a more important goal. What a goal.
All right, so 2011 Champions League final. Why is that the optimal moment of suspense on the orthodox definition? It's midway through the game. Manchester United are 1 goal down. Looks like they're going to be basket cases. Suddenly, they get that goal. There's a second half to goal. Everything's possible now, right? And nobody knows the outcome, right? And you can hear it in the tenor of the commentator's remarks, right? You know, we don't know what's going to happen. So that's orthodox suspense. And as I'm suggesting, you know, we experience suspense in many other contexts in addition to narrative experience, right? Movie experience and so forth. Now, what about anomalous suspense? Anomalous suspense is a phrase that's been used to recognize the fact that even when we know the outcome of something, we can get that suspenseful experience again. So I was going to show you an extract from the film United 93, right, which is one of the films made in the wake of 9/11, right, about the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, right? Now, we all know, right, you know, we all know where that story's going to end, right? And yet it's quite clear that the movie has been designed to elicit profound feelings of suspense, right, and seems to work, right, for most viewers, right? So if suspense is supposed to be the state which depends upon ignorance of the outcome, how comes you get it, right, when you know full well what the outcome is? Or think of Titanic. We all know what's going to happen, right? At least in broad outline, right? So I can't go, there isn't time for me to go through this in fine detail, but here's the thrust of how my analysis goes. Right? So bearing in mind that, as I said earlier, with this triangulation model, we've got various sources of evidence and levels of analysis with which we can kind of approach this weird problem, right? We can think about the kind of feeling we're having, right? Or for example, we could look at what's going on in the brain in these different kinds of cases, or we could look at what our psychological theories seem to suggest about this kind of case. So just to dwell on one of those possibilities, it could be, right, I want to suggest that in the case of a film like United 93, well, we might think it's suspense, right? But actually, if we reflect on it long enough, it's more like, and I don't mean to trivialize it by saying, it's more like a visit to the dentist, right? In the following sense, right? It's a grim experience, right? You're not having fun while you're in the dentist's chair, but you're in no doubt that it's going to come to an end. Right? Doesn't make the grimness of the experience disappear just because you know it's going to end. So maybe the character of watching a film like United 93 isn't really suspense. And part of the thought here is that actually if we just kind of, you know, reflect on our feelings, we're not necessarily very good at discriminating one type of feeling from another, not at that sort of fine-grained way. So that's where neuroscience might be our friend again, right? So this is really more of a proposal and a hypothesis, unlike the earlier case studies where I'm saying there's a body of established evidence out there which we can latch onto and we can fruitfully incorporate into our own existing arguments. Here I'm saying it's an invitation, right, to the neuroscientists. I'm saying one way of figuring out whether anomalous suspense, as it's called, is or is not just like orthodox suspense will be to see what's happening in the brain. Right? If we find that we're essentially getting the same patterns of neural activation in the two cases, that's a kind of evidence in favor of saying, well, it really is suspense. Okay? If we get completely different, right, pictures of brain activation, it would point in the other direction. Right? So that's the third example, right, a forward-looking example where I'm saying we could perhaps use neuroscience as a tool to solve a recognized problem, the problem of anomalous suspense. So, I'm just going to wrap up now. Yes, there I am. Concluding thoughts. Thank you for your patience. So what I've tried to present tonight is an argument for a kind of methodological pluralism and a kind of interdisciplinarity, but a kind of coordinated one, right? So I'm not just saying, you know, just kind of like, you know, draw upon anything that you find handy. I mean, that's not a bad starting point, but it's not very good in the long run, right? I'm rather saying, yes, look to different kinds of method, but then look to how they speak to each other, how those different bodies of evidence integrate or don't, because if they don't sit together well, then that suggests that maybe some part of the picture is wrong, possibly. So in a slogan, I'm suggesting that many things go, but not anything goes, right? So that takes us back to one of those early slides where I said that I think we all buy into a principle that there are certain kind of bodies of once respected thinking about the world, which we just don't find acceptable anymore, right? I don't think there's anyone in the audience who's a flat earther, right? So, many things go, but not anything goes. And just to draw for a last remark on that very idea, one other, the flat earth idea, one other idea from exactly the same moment to the year as the C.P. Snow original essay, which at least amongst philosophers has much more currency, is a distinction made between the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, the American philosopher, between what he called the manifest and the scientific views of the world. Right? So what Sellars had in mind, and he said this originally in 1956, same year as Snow's first article, was he said that as science develops, we get this increasingly kind of dividing picture between ordinary experience and what science tells us about the world, right? So even though we all accept that the Earth is spherical, I hope, right, it doesn't change our everyday experience, right? We carry on perceiving the Earth as flat in our immediate location, right? So he described that through this kind of difficulty of the division between the manifest and the scientific world pictures. And it was a kind of major part of Sellars' philosophical work was to figure out, to use his expression, how do these things hang together? How do we make sense of a world in which we have such divergent experiences and bodies of knowledge? And I think a lot of people in these debates kind of are looking for maybe a holy grail that doesn't really exist. They're looking for the idea that you can bring these two things into perfect fusion, right? Like two images in a stereoscope which kind of like lock together, right? And you get a seamless experience. I wonder if that's necessary or possible, and that maybe we have to kind of learn to live with a kind of double vision, right? That our experience of the world is one way, and that has a kind of legitimacy, obviously in many contexts. But you know, we have to take seriously what the scientists tell us about the world, and sometimes that's going to have implications for us, for the theories we have about the arts, and it's going to inflect them in particular ways. And I think that's as good a note as any for me to end on. Thanks. Thanks.